Hello. Good afternoon. So it is 6 right now, and we will begin studying CompTIA A plus course. So let's go back to the beginning.
Whom it may concern. I'm applying for the position of Information Security Analyst. I've always been interested in helping people.
Hi, and welcome to this A+ introductory course. My name is Josh Penzel. I'm a CompTIA certified technical trainer, and I have my A+, Network+, Security+, and Cloud Essentials certifications. I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer and Microsoft Office specialist, which isn't necessarily pertinent to this course, but it's interesting information nonetheless. I received my A+ certification in 2000, which was 12 years ago. And since then, the test has gone through quite a bit of changes. That being said, I've also helped hundreds of people get their CompTIA certifications, and I have no doubt that you're going to get yours too. Now, there's a lot of information that's going to be covered on this course, and so I just want to take a moment to tell you a little bit about CompTIA, the test, and what we're going to cover. CompTIA is what we call a vendor-neutral organization, meaning that they're not owned by anyone. So the test is supposed to have a nice wide variety of all of the information that you need to know in the IT field, independent of a specific manufacturer. That being said, one of the largest operating systems and contributors to our IT field is Microsoft. So you're going to see a lot of that on the test. That being said, we've also added a few things to the A+ exam since I first started. For instance, mobile phones or smartphones and tablets, all covered on this exam. Now, the test, because there's so much information, is actually broken up into two different tests. There's 220-801 and 220-802. When you complete both of these exams, you will receive your A+ certification from CompTIA. Now, 801 is supposed to cover more facts. What is a computer? What is a CPU? What is a display? And so on. 802 is supposed to be more about setting up those and troubleshooting them. However, I find most of the information to overlap quite a bit, and I always recommend people who want to take the certification actually study for both tests at the same time. That way you can either sit for both tests back to back on the same day or in a short distance from each other. The reason being that information from both is going to show up on each exam. They're not very well distinguished. Each test consists of about 90 questions, and you have about 90 minutes to complete them. Some people find the 801 test easier, some people find 802. To me, they're basically the same. The only difference is you need a 675 out of 900 for the 801 exam, and you need a 700 out of 900 for the 802 exam. So the passing rate is slightly higher.
900?
That being said, I'm expecting most of you to get in the 800 realm after we finish this course.
Right.
Now, there's a lot of information covered on this course, and as many of you probably know, A+ is an introductory course before you're going to get your Security Plus and Network Plus certifications as well. As a result, A+ actually has information on networks and security covered. So studying for your A+ exam is actually really going to help you with your Network Plus and Security Plus information too. And studying for them concurrently or around the same time is going to help you pass all of these certifications. But we'll talk more about those later. So the first thing we're going to do in this course is talk about computers, the hardware. Then we're going to look at software, followed by networking, displays, security, and mobile devices. One thing I want to make very clear is although you're going to be studying by watching these videos, I also want you to get used to taking multiple choice questions, because the majority of the test, although not all of it, does have multiple choice questions, meaning they'll give you a situation or ask you a question, and then they'll give you...
Easy peasy. So it's like a driving test, you know? It's just multiple choice, mostly multiple choice. So, yeah, I would say it's going to be... I think I would pass this.
Several answer
First
choices.
try.
If you can master taking multiple choice exams, you're going to master this exam. There are, however, on this new A+ exam, what are called performance-based questions, which is relatively new, maybe a year old. This means they're going to ask you to do certain things. For instance, recognize parts of a motherboard, or put together a computer that would be good for a big gamer. Either way, most of the questions will be multiple choice, although some will be performance-based. Mm-hmm. Studying throughout this entire course is going to prepare you for both parts of this. Another thing to note is that A+ assumes that you have 6 months of experience in the field. If you don't, that's fine. Don't worry about it. We're going to get you up to speed. If you have more than this, then that's good, but don't get overconfident. A+ is a very specific way it likes to see things on the exam. And I'm going to spend the majority of this course not only going over information, but covering it in a way that's not too in-depth, I hope, but gets you prepared to take the test. The journey starts here. It doesn't end here. With that being said, let's get into the course, starting with an overview of computers.
Overview of computer. Let me take some notes. Might be really useful later on when you study it. And guys, if you need the notes, I will send it to you. I'll link it somewhere in the description. And yeah. So first is going to be computer components. Computer components. Right, so let's make this H3. Pretty much, this is like an entry level, so I'm assuming it's more like ICT, like high school stuff at the beginning, and then maybe you get into like a little bit more advanced later on, but I would say this is more like a IT class in high school. Maybe it goes a little bit in depth into what is actually in the computers.
The computer, an overview. Before we can delve into the complexities of a computer, I want to go over all the parts that make a computer. And when I was looking for a way to provide a metaphor to those who might not be as familiar with computers, I came across this 1613 definition in the Oxford English Dictionary that said, a computer is a person who makes calculations or computations. Now, obviously, there weren't any machines, there wasn't even electricity at this point, so a person had to do all the calculating. And then I saw the next definition from 1869, a device or machine for performing facilitating calculations, and then the 1946 definition, which, well, is a lot more complex. And I thought, using a person...
I think the more like we move forward, the more complex of the definition is going to be. So like you can see 1613, it's just like a few words that describe the computers. Then 1869, like nearly 200 years later, it's still like a little bit, more words, and now it's getting a little bit more complicated. 1946 though, look at that. This is like full-on computers. And now maybe in 2023, 2024, everything might be completely different. Maybe it's going to be on an AI, something like that, right?
And as a metaphor to talk about a computer is actually really powerful. Because in many ways, they're really similar. And so what I want to do is go through your body, and I'd like to compare it to a computer. So the first thing your body has, as you probably know, is skin and bones, a structure. Now this structure provides a framework in which everything else fits. All your organs fit in certain spots. Your legs are on the bottom, your feet below that, your arms are at the top, your head above that, and it's all perfectly weighted in order to support all of this. Now, the other thing your body, your skin and bones do is they protect everything on the inside from everything on the outside. So, for instance, when someone hits you or when you fall, your heart doesn't fall out of your body, right? It's held in by your rib cage and then your skin and your muscles. And so your skin and bones provides protection from all of those elements. And of course, this body of yours has been perfectly designed to support all of these different parts. Now this, your skin and bones, is very much like a computer chassis, which is also called the case, or the structure. And as you can see in this image I pulled up here, you have several things that make a chassis a chassis. For instance, you have lots of vents because computers get very hot. And so this thing is perfectly created to allow for airflow. There's also lots of spots for hard drives, like over here. And as you can see from all these locks down here, this thing protects all of these internal components from the outside. You also have a spinal cord. Your spinal cord is what everything plugs into, for lack of a better word. And it's really what allows your body to talk to all the different parts of your body. So when my hand moves, that's my brain talking through my spinal cord to my hand. It allows all these different body parts as well to talk with my brain, which controls everything. So not just can my body, and not just can my brain talk to my hand actually talks to my body. My eyes talk to my brain. Everything talks to each other. I sing the body electric, is Walt Whitman said. And this spinal cord is very much like, in computers, what we call a motherboard, or a system board. And this system board allows you to plug in everything. You have expansion slots, which we'll talk about, and RAM slots here, and spots to plug in all your storage devices, and all sorts of little chips that allow everything to talk to one another. And so, in many ways, your spinal cord is very much like this motherboard. You also have a brain. And your brain, as you probably know, is extremely important because it processes all of the incoming and outgoing information from your body. So when your eye sees something, that goes to your brain and that processes it. And then your brain can spit something out through your mouth. It's also extremely complex, and it's very fast. I mean, our brain works so fast that we move, we breathe, we walk without even having to think about it because our brain is processing at that high of a speed. Finally, without it, we can survive, we can live, but we're basically a vegetable. We're not aware of anything. We can't process new information. And so our brains are very much like, in computers, what are called CPUs, or the Central Processing Unit. And this Central Processing Unit basically is what makes the computer run. It does all of the processing. All of the information that goes through that motherboard, through that spinal cord, it goes to the Central Processing Unit. And that CPU processes this information and sends it back to all the different pieces. And you also have two different types of memory in your brain. The first type, short-term memory, is limited in what it can hold. A lot of people think we can hold about 4 to 7 things in our short-term memory at any one time. And that's because our short-term memory is what we use to work on a project or work on something. It's what we're keeping in our head at any one moment. And that's what allows us to do our work. It only runs because of this when we're awake or when we're aware. We're not keeping things in our short-term memory when we're sleeping. It kind of goes to sleep as well. And this is similar to, in a computer, what's called RAM, or Random Access Memory.
Random access memory.
And this random access memory, this RAM, is what allows us to work on things. It's like our desktop, which we can put files on and work on them during the day, just like our short-term memory. But it's limited in how much information it can hold. Because we also have a different type of memory, long-term memory.
Wrong.
Now, long-term memory holds far more information than our short-term memory because we're not using it every time we're working. We access deep information in there that we can store for later use. So it's a lot bigger because of this, but we also need the short-term memory, right? We need that random access memory in order to work with this long-term memory. And some think that the information in our long-term memory remains there always. Your long-term memory can store information for years and years, and that's where it files stuff away, like your file storage cabinet. And this is just like what we call in computer storage. These are your hard drives, or your floppy drives, or your optical drives. These are things that store information for later use that we can bring into our short-term, bring into our random access memory, and then we can do something with it.
Do you want to jump off the help desk right into a six-figure cybersecurity career? Or maybe you just got started in IT and realized that you...
And we also have a stomach GI tract, right? And our stomach provides us with fuel. This is what allows us to keep running. It feeds all of these internal processes, our brain, our muscles, our heart. These all require constant fuel, and they require resources. And that's what our stomach provides. And without it, we will eventually die. You can go, a few days without food, even longer without water, but at a certain point, unless you're feeding your body, unless you're getting fuel, you can't survive. And just like with anything with electricity, this is our power supply. This is what fuels every single part of this electronic computer. We also have senses, the 5 senses that most people know: sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. And these are how you receive information from the outside world, right? You use your senses to look around you, to hear things, to taste something. And each of these senses can pick up a different type of information. They're attuned to specific things. My eyes are attuned to looking, my ears for hearing, and I use them for different things. And this gives our information, our CPUs, something to process, something to take and chew on, no pun intended. And this is what we call input devices, like what I have here, like a keyboard or a mouse, for instance, are our 2 most basic input devices, because they allow us to input stuff into our computer, into the CPU.
For some reason, the mouse and the keyboard, despite having a lot of issue, I would say, but it's still like it unreplaceable. Like you can see like the phone screen. It used to be like a mechanical buttons, and now it's all like touch screen. But I haven't seen a computer that is completely like touchscreen and stuff like that. So yeah, we might see a computer that is like touch only, right, in the future, maybe.
Into the hard drive. And this is very different from speech and movement, right? These are the outputs. This is what lets us communicate to the world and people around us. And I can use my mouth to taste something, but I can also use my mouth to speak, to use language, to reach out. I can use a gesture to explain something. And these allow us to convert our thoughts, our internal, into something external, into our actions. This is also what permits other people to take our ideas and compute them themselves. So this really allows for communication. Someone else's input system, their ability to hear or see me, and my ability to send a message. And in computers, this is what we call an output device. And these are things like printers, or the most necessary output device, a display, so that we can see what's going on in the computer. Finally, we have this whole nature versus nurture debate, right? We have our bodies, we have our brains, but unless there's something telling our brains how to use all of this stuff, it's pretty pointless, right? This nature versus nurture, what we learn, this is our context. This is how we embrace the world. It provides us with language to go with our voice, meanings to go along with our gestures. And it's a guide for dealing with the world around us. And in computers, this is what software does. It provides a translator from the CPU, from the brain, to the user, to allow me to be able to type something into the computer, and the computer knows exactly what I'm saying. Now that's like us learning. That's like our instinct. That's a baby chicken pecking through the egg when it first is born. So what we're going to do in this A+ class is talk about all of these different pieces. Our output devices, input devices, power supplies, storage devices, memory, CPUs, our brains, our motherboards, our system boards, and the chassis. And once we understand all of these pieces, then we'll have a better sense for how a computer operates, and we'll have a better sense for not only how to fix them, but how to connect each computer to the other. So without further ado, let's get into talking about each one of these individual pieces.
To whom it may concern, I'm applying for the position of Information Security Analyst. I've always been interested in helping people solve problems, and I recently completed a Google Career Certificate in IT support. It's given me a solid foundation in important areas like help desk support, networking, systems administration, and cybersecurity. I'm confident I'd be a valuable addition to your team.
Put your skills to work with a Google Career Certificate.
That's a good ad.
Motherboards, chipsets, and buses. Now, as you recall, we said that motherboards were the spinal cord of the computer, meaning that it's the thing that allows everything to communicate together, and it's what connects all the different parts of the computer together. So as you can imagine, it's a pretty complex and complicated piece of equipment. So before we can discuss how to install motherboards or how to even plug things into motherboards, we need to talk about some of the infrastructure of a motherboard itself and the architecture of it. So some of the things I'm going to talk about in this video are the vocabulary that we're going to see come up again when we talk about motherboards, and 3 words that we'll talk about specifically are chipset, bus, and lane. And no, although those words do have other meanings, I don't mean driving a bus on the lane on the highway. We're talking about these in electronics. We're also going to talk about parallel versus serial communication, which are 2 types of communication that occur in just about every type of electronics. And we're going to see this come up over and over again, not only when we're talking about motherboards, but when we get into networking as well. Once we do that, we're going to talk about chipsets in particular. Specifically, there are 2 manufacturers who make chipsets. There are 2 main chips that have been developed in these chipsets, the North Bridge and the South Bridge. We'll talk about the difference between those, and I'm going to point out now that these are really important, and they will come up on the A+ exam, so you definitely want to pay attention, okay?
Mm-hmm.
We're also going to talk about the DMI, Direct Media Interface, which is what connects the North Bridge and the South Bridge together. Then we'll talk about buses, the front side bus or the hypertransport bus, which are just the same exact thing, the memory bus, and finally the expansion bus, which is where we'll leave off.
There must be a reason why they call it buses or bus.
And we'll discuss these 2 buses in more depth in later videos as well. All right. So first, let's discuss the word chipset. You've seen it probably in the objectives, and you've heard me talk about it. But really what a chipset is a group of integrated circuits or chips that are designed to work together and are usually marketed as a single product. So this is why when we have different types of motherboards, they have different chipsets, meaning the internals of them are the same. So although the motherboard, the spinal cord, is called the same thing on every human, it works differently. Perhaps from a human to a different type of animal that also has a spinal cord. You'll also notice physically these motherboards look very differently. And that's going to be something we're going to call a form factor. Form factor being the outside, the physical build of a motherboard. Okay? But what we're talking about here in chipset is the internal build of it. We'll talk more about form factors a little later, and that has a lot to do with chassis. A bus is one wire or a group of wires that carry data from one place to another. So very simply, just like a bus you drive, a computer bus is what carries data from one place to another, just like the cord that you plug in from your smartphone to your computer has buses on it. All right, but we're talking in terms of motherboard, something that's integrated onto the motherboard. And if we look really closely and zoom in on a motherboard, we'll see lots of these little circuits built on to the motherboard, and they're integrated. So I'm going to highlight a couple right here. I see one, right? And this is a circuit that's integrated onto the motherboard, allows communication.
Oh, so that is why there's lines on the
and there are several others
motherboard.
here. And we can see them all over the place, and these are integrated right onto the board, and that's what allows computer electronics to talk to one another. And you can see these all over the place, so I don't need to draw over every single one. But you get an idea of where these buses are and how ubiquitous they are on a motherboard. When we're talking about communication, electronic communication specifically, there are really two main types we're going to see over and over again, not just on a motherboard, but when we get to networking as well. The first is serial communication. Now, serial communication has to do with sending one bit of data at a time. If you pardon my not-so-straight lines here, that means that, just like this, I'm sending one piece of data at a time. So this piece of data right here has to arrive before, or has to be sent, rather, before I can send this piece of data. So you can see there's a limit to how much data I can send at any one point. Now, this is very different from parallel, which allows me to send multiple bits of data at a time. So I could send 4, let's say, bits of data, or 8. All right, now, one thing that's important to know here is that all of this data is traveling in the same direction. Okay, so this doesn't allow, serial or parallel doesn't differentiate between the direction the data is going, just how much data can be sent at any one time. Now, what's also important is you'll see here this word bit, all right, and you'll see it down here. Now, when I say bit in computers, we're not just talking about a very small amount. There's actually a mathematical amount that we're talking about. And what that is the difference between bits and bytes. This is probably something you've seen, but you're not even aware of. There are 8 bits in 1 byte. And you'll notice here that bits are represented by a lowercase b, whereas bytes are represented by an uppercase b. Okay, so 1 megabit per second is equivalent to 125 kilobytes per second. So that's why when you get your cable modem installed and they say, oh, you're going to get, let's say, 16 megabits per second transfer rate, and you get home and you're really only going to get 2 megabytes per second in transfer. Right? And when we talk about storage and hard drives later, we deal with this big B, the megabytes. So that's where the confusion lies. So it's really important to differentiate between these. We'll come back to this number 8.
Right, so we go bit versus byte. Bit. 8 bits equal 1 byte. B-Y-T-E.
8. Again and again, especially when we get into networking. So it's really important to pay attention to that. Again, 8 bits in 1 byte. Also, something I want to point out just while we're here, as you see the M and the K. This all is math, right? So if I have 1 byte, that's 1 kilobyte would be 1,000 bytes. 1 megabyte would be 1,000 kilobytes. 1 gigabyte would be 1,000 megabytes, etc., etc., etc. All right. The last vocabulary word I want to talk about is lane. And what a lane is 2 serial wires that enable the sending and receiving of data simultaneously. So this means that now, instead of just sending over data and then having it sent back over the same cord, I can actually instead send data and receive data at the same time. So you can see how this is going to allow for a different type of communication. Okay, so we've now covered some vocabulary. We covered what a chipset was, base and lane, and we also talked about parallel versus serial communication with a little bit in there about bit versus byte.
Bit versus byte.
So let's get into
So a
chipset.
lane is like it can go forward and backward. A bus is only a wire. It's only a wires that send data. It's a main wire. I would say main wire.
There are 2 main chipset manufacturers, and when it comes to motherboards, I should say. And these are the same names you're going to see with central processing units, or CPUs, Intel and AMD. And what this means is not that they actually make the chip, right? You see Sony on some and Samsung on others. But what this means is they've come up with the chipset, the architecture of these motherboards, of these CPUs. So it's important to recognize these two. Now, when it comes to speed or quality, these are pretty much equal, right? There's really no difference here. There used to be arguments who is better, Intel or AMD, but nowadays that argument is we don't really hear it anymore. All right, so now let's get into this. Is a really important part of A+, is there are 2 main chips that control communication on a PC motherboard: the North Bridge and the South Bridge. The
Right.
North Bridge.
2 main chip control. Two main chips control the communications on a PC motherboard. Board, which is North Bridge. Man, I have to invest into this company. South Bridge. I haven't heard of this company yet.
Which is also called the memory controller hub, for a reason you'll see in a second, is responsible for high data transfer devices. So think about North, high, it's higher up. It's going to be responsible for high transfer devices. And there are 2 main high data transfer devices we're talking about here: high-speed graphics and memory, or RAM, which is random access memory. These 2 items need the fastest communication to the CPU, to the brain of the computer, the central processing unit. Now, this is different from the South Bridge, again, lower than the North Bridge, which is also called the I/O controller hub, or the ICH. And this is for secondary controllers, just about anything else, okay? So any input-out devices, such as hard drives, USB, Ethernet, just about everything else is going to be controlled by South Bridge. So when you see North Bridge or South Bridge on the exam and it asks you what device is transferred over those,
Right, so we go. So this is just mainly characteristic of this 2 device, right? So there's one high speed, high data transfers device, RAM, and high-speed graphics. So when you play game, it's mainly use the North Bridge graphics. Right, all right. So next one is going to be I/O hub controllers. I/O hub controllers, aka I/O hub controllers hub, and this is called aka memory controllers hub, right?
You want to remember that
Most input output device, most input / output devices. Next one is hard drive, USB, Ethernet, hard drive, commas, USB / Ethernet, etc. dot.
the only devices that are going to use the North Bridge are high-speed graphics and RAM. If you can remember this, it makes it very easy to answer any questions, okay? So again, high-speed graphics and RAM are controlled by the North Bridge. The South Bridge, everything else. That's what allows communication between everything else.
All right. High-speed
Here is a
graphics
diagram of the North Bridge
and
and
RAM.
the South Bridge. You can see. Again, you can see that here's the you can see here I have graphics, and here's memory, the only two things connected directly to the North Bridge, as well as the CPU, which makes sense because it's the fastest required. It requires the fastest communication. And the South Bridge, just about everything else, right? So I got my onboard graphics controller, some other external buses, etc. We'll talk about what all these things mean a little later. We see this here as well, right? North Bridge PCI Express, which is a high-end graphics card we'll talk about. That connects to the North Bridge. RAM, North Bridge, everything else, South Bridge.
RAM and high graphic. Like
The direct media interface is what connects the North Bridge and the South Bridge. So if we go back here, you see here, direct media interface. This is called the internal bus, but that's just another name for the direct media interface. This is what connects the North Bridge to the South Bridge. I just point this out so that if you see the term direct media interface on the test, you know that that's the thing that connects the North Bridge and the South Bridge together.
right. So this direct media interface connects the North Bridge and South Bridge together. Okay.
These two main chips that control communication on our motherboard. So now we've talked about the chipset. We've talked about Intel versus AMD, our two main competitors and manufacturers. The North Bridge, again, responsible for RAM, communication, and high graphics. And the South Bridge, which is everything else. And the DMI, direct media interface, which connects the two together. So let's get into buses.
Wow.
Build custom industrial machines in days. Design your machine in the simplest online CAD.
A sexy
So we
machine.
see two different definitions here, front-side bus and hypertransport. And the only difference between these, they're exactly the same, is one is what Intel calls it, the other is what AMD calls it, okay? And what the front-side bus is, the very front of that bus, right? What's the most important thing of our computer? The brain, right? And that's the CPU. So the front side bus is what allows the CPU to communicate with the North Bridge or with the rest of the motherboard. Okay, so that's the front side bus. It is that communication route between the North Bridge and the CPU, and between, in effect then, the South Bridge and the CPU as well. The memory bus also connects to, do you know what? That's right, the North Bridge, right? Because memory bus, right, again, is the fast speed that needs to go straight to that North Bridge, has a closer connection to the CPU over here. All right, so the memory bus is where all the RAM plugs in. We'll talk more about these memory slots that you see represented right here in a later video. Expansion buses are all the other buses that allow us to expand the capabilities of the motherboard. And if we go look at a motherboard real quickly, you can see several of these expansion buses here, right? So here's a couple. These are called PCI expansion buses, and here's an expansion bus. And then we have several expansion buses for storage devices here. And you can see a couple expansion buses, or devices rather, already plugged into expansion buses if you look right here. And the next video is what we're going to talk about are these specific expansion buses and the differences between them. All right, but before we get there, let's just recap what we've talked about. So we just talked about all the different buses: front side bus, hypertransport bus, memory bus, and expansion buses. So recap this entire video. We talked about certain vocabulary, chipset being all those chips put together and marketed as one, a set of chips, if you will. The bus, which transports data from one place to another. A lane, which allows for communication in and out. We talked about parallel versus serial communication. Parallel meaning more than one bit of data at a time, whereas serial is one bit of data at a time. We also talked about the chipsets, the two major manufacturers, Intel and AMD. The North Bridge, which again, I'm just going to write it up here again, allows the connection of RAM, or rather the communication of RAM, random access memory, and high-speed graphics. I just want to write that again because it's an easy way to remember this. You don't have to remember every single thing the South Bridge does. All you have to do is remember the North Bridge is responsible for RAM and graphics, and now you know exactly what the North Bridge and the South Bridge control. So we also talked about the South Bridge, which is everything else other than these two things, RAM and graphics, and the DMI, Direct Media Interface, which connects these two, the North Bridge and the South Bridge, together. We talked about buses, the front side bus, which is also called the Hypertransport bus on AMD, a memory bus, which communicates between the memory, the front side bus and Hypertransport bus, like their names, CPU communication. And finally, expansion buses, which allow us to expand the capabilities of our motherboard and plug other things into it. So, with all that being said, let's move on to the next video and talk about our expansion buses and the type of storage, the different technologies that go along with those, and the different types of storage technologies we have.
Motherboard, expansion boards, and storage technology. Module 2 is going to be motherboard / expansions board and storage technology. Right.
Motherboards, expansion buses, and storage technology. Now that we've discussed motherboards and what makes them the spinal cord of the computer, I want to talk specifically about two ways we add things to the motherboard so the computer has more functionality. Expansion buses allow us to add new technologies to the motherboard via different types of buses we'll discuss. And in storage technology, I just want to look briefly at the two main storage technologies we use. When it comes to computers, and we will revisit them when we get into storage more fully.
Want to join the six-figure club? Google and other tech companies are hiring hundreds of thousands of workers in non-coding positions. Over 400 of the hottest tech.
So first of all, we're going to talk about expansion buses, and there are several different expansion buses you need to know for the A+ exam. I'm going to focus on what makes them different from each other to help you remember. The first is ISA. The second is PCI. Now, PCI has several different iterations: PCI X, or PCI Extended, PCIe, which also is PCI Express, and Mini PCI, which, as the name implies, was a smaller version of the PCI bus. I'll also mention AGP, specifically for graphics, AMR and CNR, which were for modem and sound expansion, and also PCMCIA, otherwise known as a PC card, which used to be used a lot in laptops, and we'll discuss those more when we get to laptops as well. Then I want to touch on the storage technology, as I mentioned, including PATA, or Parallel ATA, and SATA, or Serial ATA. Alright, so let's start with expansion buses. The first expansion bus I want to describe is called ISA, which also stands for Industry Standard Architecture. And this expansion bus you're not going to see a lot, and sometimes it's not even on the exam much anymore. But I mention it because you might see it, and you might see it in some computers someplace, and I just want to make sure you're aware of it. So the ISA port is actually right here. It's this long one. And you'll see that there's actually sort of an extension on it at the end here. Right here. And that's because this first part supported 16 bits of data. As we know that is 2 bytes worth of data. And then over here we have an extension that allowed for 32 bits. Okay? Wow. So really what this older extension bus was attempting to do was allow you to connect more and more complicated devices. But eventually it just became out of date, and it couldn't sort of hold what it needed to. And so what we did is then we went to PCI, which is the next version we're going to look at. And PCI has several iterations I want to talk about. All right. First, PCI stands for Peripheral Component Interconnect. Let me just write that out here.
Peripheral. So the first one is ISA.
On the SATA or AT.
Expansion bus. Expansion buses. First of all, we have the ISA. aka call this information. Is it? Remember the middle part is standards, architecture, and the first part, architecture. How do you spell architecture? Architecture. There we go. First one.
Is you might see it in some computers someplace, and I just want to make sure you're aware of it.
Industry.
So the ISA port is actually right here. It's this.
So basically, it's an extension of a 16-bit bus, right? Like a 16-bit dock. It's a 32, so this can expand to 32 bits.
Part. So it's to interconnect. Let me just write that out for which is the next version we're going to look at. Sort of, but eventually it just do, and then, as we know that is 2 bytes worth of data. And then over here we have an extension that allowed for 32 bits. Okay.
So it's another 32-bit. It's not adding up to 32 bits. So this part is in themselves 32 bits. I don't know why it's so small, but it looks like it is 1/3 of this 16 bits. Not too sure why.
So really what this
maybe this technology is
and
too
PCI
old.
has several iterations I want to talk about. All right. First, PCI stands for Peripheral Component Interconnect. Let me just write that out here.
What is the middle one? Component. In the
And what was great about PCI was it was a new standard. It supported the same functions found on the CPU or processor bus, but it had its own assigned address space. So it allowed the CPU to do its own thing and allowed the PCI bus to do its own thing. Now that's not as important as just knowing that the PCI is probably one of the more common expansion buses we see. And there were 2 additional ones that were created for desktop computers. The first was PCIe. Sorry, the first was actually PCI X. And the X comes from extended with the big X. Now, it's important to know the difference between that because even though it starts with an E, it is not PCIe. And PCI X allowed for a 32-bit expansion bus. Now, when we get to PCIe, and the E stands for Express, this lets us get some really high-end devices onto the computer. It's basically replaced every other major expansion port at this point. So PCIe or PCI Express is the one you're going to see the most when you look out. And all of these are just different versions of the PCI expansion bus, right? These are all different PCI expansion, but different ones, different sizes for different bits, etc. It's not important that you be able to recognize them because you're not going to see them in that way on the computer. And if you look closely, even if you're on a computer right here, you can see it says PCIe 4. I don't know if you can see that, but it's sort of hidden there behind the motherboard. But it'll label it for you and tell you exactly what the computer is capable of. But the important thing to know is that PCIe is the fastest one that is currently on the market. Now, Mini PCI, as the name implies, was created specifically for laptops and also smaller computers. And it has less to do with the physical size than it does with the sort of architecture, which is made to be smaller, so it could fit on laptop motherboards. So now that we've covered PCI, I want to talk about AGP, which is another major one. Again, AGP has been mostly replaced by PCIe, right? So PCIe is still our most common one that we see. But AGP specifically stood for, and this is an AGP port right here. You can see it. And I have another picture on the next page. You'll be able to notice it, right? And both of these, as they point out, these are PCIs. Okay, so what happened was, for a while, the PCI wasn't very fast, and we needed something that could specifically deal with graphics. And so they created this AGP, which stands for Accelerated.
Accelerated.
Graphics port. And as the name implies, it was specifically for graphics, and graphics cards were made specifically to utilize it. Now, of course, what happened is eventually PCI came in and replaced AGP, but AGP was the main graphics card interface for a long time, and if you see it on the test, you want to know that it has to do mostly with displays and graphics, okay? So just remember that. If you see AGP, you want to remember this word right here, this graphics word. And if we go to the next page, too, you'll see you can see this AGP port here. And actually, just to give us a quick review, all of these are PCI.
Is it the same as graphic cards, or this is just to attach the graphic cards into it? I'm assuming it's just there for the graphic cards to sit on it, right?
Ports next to this AGP right here. And we also have some old school ISAs. So this motherboard, I can tell, comes at a point before PCIe, but when AGP had just been invented. So this sort of dates the motherboard, and you can tell they had to put in these ISAs right over here. Let's write up, those are the ISAs. And over here, those are PCIs. And they had to put these ISAs still in here because people probably still had ISA expansion ports. All right, so the next one I just want to mention briefly, and you're not going to see it a lot, is this one, AMR and CMR. And these were specifically made to support sound cards and also modems. I don't know why those two, although we do see a lot of sort of similarities in how they're created. But either way, this was specifically for audio and modems, and the reason you can remember that is because AMR is
audio,
modem, riser. Right? And these were specifically for the needs of audio and modem capabilities. We don't see them a lot anymore, again, because of PCIe, which basically did away with all of these other weird expansion ports that they tried putting in. Finally, on motherboards, you're going to be seeing a lot of Finally, on laptops, you're going to see a lot of CompTIA A cards. Now, you might remember these, depending on how old you are, because you had little slots on the side of your laptop that these could plug into. And you could expand just about anything using these. So, for instance, this is a network card. And right here, which you can't see, there's a little network slot. And this just plugged right into a hole on the side of the laptop and allowed you to expand the laptop without having to do a lot of opening up of the laptop and its components, which could get a little tricky. And if we take a look, this is more of an internal CompTIA card. Now, the difference here, this is also an Ethernet card, actually, for networks, right? And you can see this is where it would plug in right here. So it's different from the sort of internal motherboard. And right here, you would plug in a little, what was called a dongle. It would sort of go off like this, and then it had a little cord on it, right? But this just gives you an idea of how small, and I wish I had a thing here to show you this sort of distance, but this is probably about 5 to 6 inches.
What?
And for those of you who deal with centimeters, it's probably about 10 centimeters, 10 to 12 centimeters as well. I'll just write that up here.
That is a huge component.
So,
for a computer, let's say 10-15 centimeters. That is big, right? 10 to 15. I'm assuming it's like that. Like close to that. That's just a huge component to put into your computer. No wonder it's like computer back then was so bulky, like so thick.
They're very small and it fit right in on the side here. And this was an expansion port specifically for laptops, okay? And here I've created a table, and you can find this, you can download this as well, that tells you these are the main expansion buses you need to know. Tells you the maximum data rate, how fast data can fly down these buses, and also how the megahertz or gigahertz, which is the speed that we can test things in. And you can see one major point is that we've replaced a 32-bit parallel architecture with a serial architecture here in the PCIe. Okay? You can also see how much faster PCI Express is when it comes to comparing it to the previous versions. And one thing that might seem a little odd is you're going, wait a minute, this one has 2 gigabytes over here, and this one is 1 gigabyte, so isn't the AGP faster? But what you'll notice is this is 1 gigabyte per lane, and if you recall, a lane allows you to send data one way and then receive it another, right? So we're sending and receiving data. We're at faster, much, much faster frequencies if you see over here. And we have 1 through 16 full duplex lanes. So I can have up to 16 serial lanes on PCIe, which really means that I'm, multiplying this 1 gigabyte by 16. So my maximum is actually closer to 16 gigabytes per second, and that includes sending and receiving data at the same time. Again, you can find this table, you can download this table, and so you can study this and remember it. You're going to want to know specifically these 3, right, for the test. You're going to want to remember some of these data rates, specifically that PCI Express is serial and that it runs on these lanes, okay? That means it's full duplex, meaning that the data can be sent and received, all right? So, we've now talked about expansion buses, including ISA, which was the oldest version, PCI Extended, which is what that X stands for. Both of these were replaced by PCIe, which we use for just about everything nowadays, especially graphics. Mini PCIe, which was made for motherboards and expansion ports on motherboards and looks very different. You probably won't run into a mini PCIe unless you're opening up a laptop. We also talked about AGP, which used to be used for graphics, but it's not used anymore because of PCIe or PCI Express. AMR, which is that audio modem riser. And finally, PCMCIA, which is a PC card specifically for laptops. And just because I don't think I actually mentioned what that stands for, PCMCIA is a personal computer memory card international association, right? And this is because originally this was used for memory only. Now it's used, or when it was used for a whole bunch of other things. All right, so let's talk now about some storage technology. And again,
Right, guys, I'm going to eat some food, and then we'll go back, and then we keep studying, right? And the stream here, we'll go back in like half an hour,